In a moment, we'll meet Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom, co-authors of America in Black and White. Abigail Thernstrom attended the president's first meeting on race in Akron, Ohio. Here's their exchange.
There ought to be a strategy to deal with the economic underclass. There ought to be a middle-class strategy, too, that embraces people across different races. We have left open the question of affirmative action. Just curiously, how many of you believe we should continue some sort of affirmative action policy with regard to admissions to colleges and universities? Okay, how many of you don't believe we should? What about out here? Change of what? That's right. Racial preferences it's a loaded word.
Believe in affirmative action. They don't believe
Abigail,
in preferences.
Do you favor the United States Army abolishing the affirmative action program that produced Colin Powell? Yes or no? Yes or no? I get asked all these hard questions all the time. I want to do it.
I do not think that it is racial preferences that made Colin Powell. The overwhelming majority of Americans want American citizens to be treated as individuals, and we've heard the voices here.
Should we abolish the Army's affirmative action program? Yes or no?
We should. The Army does one thing very, very right. It prepares kids. It takes kids before the Army, and it prepares them to compete equally. That's what you're talking about when you're talking about American education.
No.
Let us have real equality of education. These preferences disguise the problem. The real problem is the racial skills gap, and we ignore it.
Washington Journal continues.
Abigail Thernstrom, what do you expect to happen today at the White House, and when are you going there?
Well, we're going at 2:15. It's a small group of us, and I hope we'll have a wide-ranging and good conversation, because the topic of race is not simply the issue of preferences. All the focus has been on that. It's really one corner of the larger picture. There are also a diversity of views in the room, and in fact, the political spectrum on the issue of race is much more complicated, much more nuanced than this kind of two camps image in the media suggests.
Stephen Thernstrom, I wanted to ask you, as I was watching the Akron thing, why you weren't there. You are the co-author of this book, America in Black and White. What was the reason that...
Well, I don't really know. I mean, they invited one of us, and they invited Abigail, and they made a wise choice. I don't think I would necessarily have challenged the president when he was polling the audience, saying, do you favor affirmative action in education? And my wife, I was sitting in the front row, and I was quite startled. My wife started saying, Mr. President, that's not the question. The question is racial preferences, which is absolutely correct in my view, but I don't think I would have quite had the chutzpah to say it. So I was delighted that she was the one who was chosen.
Let me ask you about your politics, because the image out there with a lot of people is that you're both conservatives because of this book and what the book says. Is that true?
Well, if you make the litmus test of whether you have the voice of the civil rights community in the late 1950s and early 1960s, that is Martin Luther King's voice, the voice of Thurgood Marshall in those years, if that's called a conservative voice, then yes, we are conservatives. But, you know, I don't regard that as a conservative voice. I regard that as the true civil rights voice.
I mean, we are 50s liberals, which doesn't make us 90s liberals, but...
How many years have you spent at Harvard, both of you?
Well, we met at Harvard in 1958 when we were graduate students. We impetuously married within 2 months of meeting each other. We've been married for 39 years, and most of that 39 years has been spent at Harvard. I taught for a few years at Brandeis and at UCLA. But other than that, we've been at Harvard all that time.
You were born in Port Huron, Michigan?
That's right.
And Abigail Thernstrom, where's your hometown?
Croton-on-Hudson, New York, and then New York City itself.
Let's go to the phone. Suitland, Maryland, for our guest. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Until 1970, the American society lived in one of preference, a pigmentocracy, if you will. If your guests would like to get rid of affirmative action, what would they use as a mechanism to offset discrimination as we know it today?
Abigail Thernstrom?
Well, I certainly believe in vigorously enforcing anti-discrimination laws, but look, the real solution to racial equality in this society is to close the gap in academic performance between blacks and whites, which is driving everything else. It's driving the position of blacks in employment, in higher education, and it's creating the alleged necessity for racial preferences in admissions, because on the average, black students are in 12th grade are reading at an 8th grade level. Now, that is a disgrace. It is a national disgrace, and I hope the discussion about preferences is going to be a national wake-up call, and black parents as well as white parents are going to say to public school educators, no, this is unacceptable. We can close that gap, and we certainly can.
Stephen Thernstrom, hold on a second. We'll take another call and let you answer this one. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, go ahead, please.
Hey, thank you for C-SPAN, Brian. How are you today?
Welcome, caller.
Hey, what I wanted to say basically was this. I think that the issue of race has gotten better over time due to just the awareness of it. But in the underlying issue here, don't your guests think that perhaps it would be better to deal with the underlying problems of education and leave the racial preference and the race issue out of it completely, because you do have the skills gap, and it is there no matter how much we might want to deny it?
Thanks.
Well, yes, indeed, that's basically what my wife just said, that preferences in higher education, for example, which admit minority students under double standards and then sort of forgets about the fact that high numbers of them flunk out, so that you haven't really done any good. You've just crushed the egos of some young people who were put into a competition in which they're set up to fail. So we would quite agree with the caller that we should be dealing with the fundamental problem and should be dealing with it not on a racial basis. All disadvantaged students need whatever help we can provide them to bring them up to a high level of achievement. And we think our school system can be made to do that, but it will take radical change.
Has the book sales changed since your situation in Akron?
I have not called our editor at Simon & Schuster to find out, but I'm crossing my fingers.
Hope so.
Plymouth, Michigan, you're next. Plymouth, Michigan, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
You're on the air, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to tell Abigail, when Clinton told her has to answer yes or no, she should have told him that she's not one of his $100,000 a year flunkies in the White House, that every time he drops his pants, she's got to say yes.
Thanks for the call. Let me throw into this, because we were in Boston, and I read the Boston Globe on the air, a story by Ann Scales a couple of Fridays ago, in which you were quoted saying, "I like him very much," meaning the president. You want to expand on that?
No, what I said to Ann Scales, she got two things wrong in that. What I said to Ann Scales was, I think he is wonderful at these town meetings, and he is wonderful. And I also said,
Which was not a broader endorsement necessarily.
Necessarily. I mean, I was simply talking about the Akron situation. I also said, when she asked me about my reaction, I said, I'm a grown-up. If I can't take the heat, I should get out of the kitchen. And somehow in her article it got changed to, if the president can't take the heat, he should get out of the kitchen. And I thought, oh, no.
Macon, Georgia, you're next.
Yes, I was listening to Abigail's comments, and basically one of the things that seems funny to me is that her comments in terms of the race gap or the gap in the educational system as far as blacks and whites are concerned. I agree with that wholeheartedly. But on the other hand, I'm in the business world, and I see it every day as much as the other people. I've got educated black people that I work with in businesses, and the same people that are white they're just barely getting out of high school, and I see this every day, and they can't get the jobs that the other people are getting. And it's not just something that you jump over easily and say, well, you know, they're just it's just an education thing. It's not just that. There is a racial preference that has existed in America for a long time, just based on the the preferences of being white in America has always put people in certain positions, whether you had the top education or not. And that's something, you know, you said real briefly, well, we have to deal with the discrimination, and then you just went past that really, you know, really fast. And that's an issue that's harder in America today to define, because it's done so smoothly, and things have changed in America. The way the people are being discriminated against is done a lot more smoother.
Caller, let me just interrupt though and ask you whether you think this discussion on race that's led by the president will make a difference in the discrimination that you see.
Well, anytime there's open discussion, it always makes things better.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Stephen Thernstrom, you want to take it?
Well, I would say to the caller that we do have a very good anti-discrimination law on the books, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it is illegal to discriminate against people in employment or education or a number of other areas. We fault the program of racial preferences, which assumes that if X% of employees in a particular firm are not black, that is a probable cause that discrimination is going on. We think that our discrimination law ought to be enforced as originally written, which involves specific individual acts of discrimination. And I think that would be excellent protection. In much of our economy today, major corporations have very strong affirmative action programs in which they are giving racial preferences to minorities and to women, and are boasting about how diverse a workforce they have. So I don't think it's at all the problem of the South in the 1960s.
Abigail Thernstrom, today at 2:15 you'll meet. It says here in USA Today that Jack Kemp, Lynn Martin, and Ward Connerly will be in the room besides you. Do you know who else is going to be there?
Yes, Linda Chavez will be there. Thaddeus Garrett from Howard University will be there.
A black man who used to work for George Bush?
Used to work for George Bush, that's correct.
Governor Kane.
Governor Kane, who was the one member of the President's Advisory Board.
Where's the meeting?
And Charles Kennedy, Congressman from Florida, will be there. I think that's the entire list. I hope I haven't left anybody out. The last I knew, the meeting was in the Oval Office.
Will the media of any kind be there?
There will be one pool reporter who is there and who will not quote from us except with a specific permission from individuals.
Who have you been dealing with at the White House to set all this up?
Ann Lewis, the Director of Communications.
Well, her name has just slipped my mind.
And were you all concerned about whether you'd be quoted or not?
That issue had not come up, but I was simply given this information yesterday that would be the rules.
None of the participants will be quoted directly?
Without their permission, they will not be quoted directly. They can give permission. There will be a transcript. They can give permission.
Salem, Virginia, you're next.
Oh, thanks for letting me on. I've been watching with great interest the issue of race, and particularly how the Democratic Party and the liberals seem to want to play the race card and actually, in my mind, be racist. They seem to choose people like Maxine Waters to get up, who apparently, at least the way it looks and the way she acts, between thinking that the CIA started the crack problem in L.A. and all the other things that she imagines, seems to hate white people. I'm a conservative Republican. I'm appalled at racism, but more troubled by the fact that the Democrats want to make it look like it's the Republicans that are the racists. You don't see the Republicans playing the race card every opportunity to win votes.
Thanks, caller.
Well, look, I would prefer to take the word racism out of the discussion of race altogether these days. It's been such a corrupted word. I mean, we've now got a situation where if you raise the subway fares in New York, it's a question of racism. But look, Maxine Waters is not my favorite voice either, and I think that, she, at the time of the Los Angeles riots, after the Rodney King decision, she, in effect, encouraged the murder of a few whites. to kind of right the historical balance, if I remember correctly. And, you know, but look, it takes all kinds, and it's at least her voice is out there, and there is too little candor on the subject of race in general. I mean, if people will speak their minds, and she certainly does, but across the political spectrum, that would be good.
What has changed for you all since all this publicity? I mean, how do you manage it, and do you get more calls than you can deal with?
Well, yes, it has been really frantic. We're used to a rather sedate academic pace, sitting at our study quietly, and the phone never stops ringing. There are faxes, there are emails. It's, I hope this will come to an end fairly soon.
And this morning you already appeared on Good Morning America somewhere in town?
Just me. Well, for very few minutes.
How long were you on there?
Well, I was on with somebody else in New York, a professor of African American Studies at Columbia, and we each had about 2 minutes.
Danville, Virginia, you're next.
Hi. I'm glad I got through. I'd just like to have a question for your panel there. I believe in affirmative action, although I do not believe in quotas. I think they're wrong. You know, I wouldn't want somebody hired just because of their race, color, gender, whatever. But I do believe that the educational gap between blacks and whites is growing immensely. And I'd just like to ask your panel guests how they feel about school detracking and putting students in mixed ability groupings as a way of combating some of that educational disparities between blacks and whites, Hispanics and Latinos.
What do you think of it? Caller, what do you think of it?
Oh, I think that students should be placed in mixed ability groupings. I'm a student at Fram College, and when I was in elementary school, I was almost placed in special education, not because of any test scores, but because my behavior. I was a little, you know, a little bad at times, I guess. But, I mean, I graduated high school with a 3.5 GPA. I was president of my senior class, and then if I had been placed in that special education class, I don't know where I would be right now today.
Well, let me answer that because I'm on the State Board of Education in Massachusetts. I mean, I don't want any student labeled at an early age as somebody who belongs in the back of the educational bus, as it were, somebody tracked in lower tracks. I do think that teachers need the flexibility to, with specific subjects, to group kids according to exactly what level of educational achievement they have attained at that moment, and again, that should be flexible, so that if you're reading at a certain level, you work with a group of children who are likewise reading at that level. But I also think all teachers must hold all students to very high standards and make them accountable for performance. Too many of our kids, we decide, all right, that kid's not going to make it, and we're going to dumb down the standards, and our expectations are going to be low.
I'm very sympathetic to that caller because I was a horrible discipline problem all through elementary and junior high school myself. So.
By the way, this is the book, America in Black and White, almost 700 pages, and it's One Nation, Indivisible, Race in Modern America. How many did they print of this book when it came out?
I don't know, something like 17,000. But you see, the industry has so changed that when the sales go up, they can very quickly put out, print some more.
What printing do you have on this, do you know?
No, we don't know.
Let me go back to today's meeting. Did you all meet as a group yet beforehand?
No.
You have not?
No.
Have you had conversations beforehand on how you're going to approach this with the president?
No, we're not really. I mean, Linda Chavez and I are very good friends. I hope I put her on the list. She's there. Yeah. We're very good friends. We've talked a little bit. I have been in contact with Ward Connerly's office, but we haven't actually connected because we're both hard to reach.
Stephen Thurnstom, have you had any conversation with the White House as who you wanted to be there in this meeting?
No, they didn't ask us who we would like to have with us. And indeed, you know, this doesn't represent an organized camp, an interest group, and we have to get our story straight. It's separate individuals, all of whom have a general perspective that's different from the White House perspective, but we don't have a manifesto that we are going to jointly, you know, present.
Our guests, Abigail and Stephen Thurnstom. We go now to Pittsburgh. Good morning.
Good morning. My question to your panelists is, as a former educator, since education is the problem, isn't it a fact that 90-some% of our public school teachers are white? Second of all, I think it's bogus for you two to sit there and make the assumption that before blacks entered the workforce, that all the white people there were qualified. Isn't it a fact that white people got jobs just because they were white? And another point to make, even the white people that are working today, not all of them are doing a great job. They're not all qualified. They got there because they knew somebody.
Caller, where were you an educator?
In the public schools.
Were you a teacher?
Yes.
Did you see, are you black or white, by the way?
I'm black.
Did you see discrimination against you because you were a black teacher?
Oh, most definitely.
In what way? How?
Well, in the way that I taught in a predominantly white school, and the black kids gravitated toward me. They looked at me as someone they could look up to. And since I could relate to them, that was a threat to the administrators. If a problem arose, the kids would come to me to help solve it. Well, the administrators felt that their position was threatened because the kids respected me.
How did they retaliate then?
Oh, I mean, there's numerous ways. Numerous ways.
How?
Oh, they put me in uncompromising positions. For instance, like if there was an athletic event, they wanted me to sit with the black students to make sure there was no trouble, to report back to them. Well, let's be a spy.
And you did not like that?
No. No, I'm a teacher. I taught all the kids. I mean, not only the black kids looked up to me, the white kids looked up to me. Hey, I see them 20 years since I've been a teacher. I'll see them in the store, and they'll come up and say, "Oh, man, you was great. You were fair." And that's what I think basically I saw it in a lot of teachers. They prejudge the students before they even got in their class.
All right, thanks.
Well, you know, that was 20 years ago, and I think a lot has changed in those 20 years. They've been very crucial years. But look, just because whites had preferences doesn't mean that preferences are a good idea for anybody. I mean, two wrongs don't make a right. Let's go on and at this point cease to judge people on the color of their skin. Public schools are making a huge effort to recruit black teachers and black administrators. I mean, they are looking desperately everywhere for them. And, you know, the truth is that the brightest and best of black college students aren't gravitating naturally towards teaching, because
nor are the brightest and best white students.
Nor are the best and brightest white students, alas, because it is such an important job in American society, because doors are finally really open to blacks. And so, you know, there are other opportunities.
Stephen Thernstrom, how do you think the media is covering this discussion so far?
Well, by that you mean the president's initiative?
Since this discussion has started and all, I said, well, maybe throw your book in there since your book's been out. What happens to your material once it's, you know, is filtered through the media?
Right. Well, I think the coverage of the president's initiative has been quite good, and has indeed properly stressed that it has been a monologue, not a dialogue. I thought the press on the Akron incident specifically, and on the president's encounter with my wife, was terrific. I was very surprised that many papers I didn't think were sympathetic to our point of view seemed very sympathetic to Abby, and thought the president had, by insisting yes or no, had overplayed his hand and had not really handled this complicated question very well.
Let's go to San Diego for our guests here on C-SPAN's Western Journal. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Hi there.
It rained last night. Terrible. C-SPAN, you're great. I'm going to run out and buy your book. It indicates to me some of the things that we're running into. I grew up in New York City when education was paramount and parents cared. Our students in our high school, when they graduated, they were ready to go out and face the world. And you see that in so many things. And they were placed on ability. Had nothing to do with race. I went to a class that was totally integrated. And we had just as many blacks as we had whites, Hispanics, and everything else. And it had nothing to do with population. It had to do with ability. Go out and chase it. Look what's happened to CCNY. When I lived in the city, it was a great school.
When Colin Powell went to it, it was a great school.
And today, I'm not so sure.
Well,
I think students placed on their abilities and given the challenge will rise to that challenge. We're not challenging kids today. And we're not drawing people into education for one reason, particularly minorities. A good, sharp black man or woman who goes out in the business field has got lots of opportunities, and education is secondary. And it's unfortunate.
Let's not talk about ability, though. Let's talk about academic achievement, because a lot of kids who are not performing well in school have plenty of ability. They need to have better education, however. You know, I want to say one word on the last question, that one of the purposes of our book is to try to get Americans to think beyond race, but also to get them off, to get beyond emoting and anecdotes. And I think that, and to, you know, look at the landscape of objective reality, of hard data. And I think that the press has yet to get to the point where, you know, they aren't mired down in, I feel this, or my neighbor said that, or the person I talked to as a reporter said this. We really, I think we can come together on this issue of race better if we move on, as I said, onto the ground of data, of facts, of objective reality.
You dedicate your book to Melanie and Sam. Mm-hmm. Who are they?
No, there are wonderful, wonderful children, and our daughter Melanie had a book out exactly the same time that we do.
What's Melanie's last name?
Thernstrom, and it's called Halfway Heaven, Diary of a Harvard Murder, and it's on the murder and suicide in June of 1995 when a Ethiopian girl stabbed her Vietnamese immigrant roommate to death in a terrible tragedy. And then committed suicide. It was originally a piece in the New Yorker, and it's now a book.
Our guests, Stephen Thernstrom and Abigail Thernstrom, if I remember right, 39 years married?
Yes.
That's right.
Well, 39 years this January.
Right. And I should add, our son Sam is the Deputy Press Secretary for the Department of Environmental Conservation in the state of New York, so he writes Governor Pataki's speeches on environmental matters.
And all the governor's op-ed pieces and so forth.
Independence, Missouri, you're next.
Brian, C-SPAN's just a great show, and how you sit there and bite your tongue day in and day out, just my hat's off to you. I don't know how you do it.
I don't have to bite my tongue because it's a lot of fun hearing what you all have to say.
Oh, I envy you beyond belief. I'd like to inject something into this that I think a lot of people are really missing, and I've looked at it and I've listened to the liberal proponents and the conservative proponents, and I'm in that new political party, the others. I think the people have looked at education as power, and if you'll look, you'll notice less educated people, as a rule, and I'm not saying everybody, tend to become Democratic, and more educated people, black and white, seem to become more Republican. And the more educated you are, the more you think for yourself, and the more you start to see through these, let's throw down the race gauntlet, let's throw down the poverty gauntlet, and you start to see that if people are controlled, well, then we have power. What I'm getting at is that the Democrats want to control, and what really drove the issue home for me is when they started talking about private schools and vouchers, how the same kids put in the same neighborhoods such as Harlem, but yet the Catholic school system educated them. They did much better in discipline. They did much better in academic achievement. In other words, they harnessed their ability. And yet the people that are watching it are saying, no, 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 we don't want our kids to have that choice. And I sat back and scratched my head, and I'm thinking, why wouldn't they want their children injected into that if they're in such a malaise in the inner city schools that we see today? They're basically harnessed chaos today. They're not getting educated. They're just taking up time until they're an adult and they can kick them out in society.
Thanks. Stephen Thernstrom?
Well, I quite agree with you, except I think you're wrong to say that the people who object to giving poor people in inner cities educational choice are rejecting it for themselves, because by and large, like our president, who doesn't favor any kind of choice in Washington, D.C., but didn't send his child to the Washington, D.C. public schools. Surprise, surprise. On the issue of education and party affiliation, it's a little more complicated. It was true back in the New Deal in general that the more educated you were, the more likely you were to be Republican. But in recent times, it's gotten more complicated, where the least educated and the most highly educated, particularly kind of Ivy League educated and so on, are more likely to be Democratic. There is a highly educated Democratic Party elite in this country.
We are going to hear from Constance Rice, who is a Los Angeles civil rights attorney and also works for the NAACP Legal Defense organization, but she will not be, an education fund is what it's called. She will not be speaking on their behalf. She'll be an independent speaker. Later on from Los Angeles, our bus is sitting outside the Los Angeles Library, and we'll also hear from Matt Drudge. Many of you have heard that word, that name in the last several months. Shreveport, Louisiana. You're on with Abigail Thernstrom and her husband, Stephen. Go ahead, please.
Yes. I'd like to say that that I appreciate you, C-SPAN. I'm a political official. I'm a city councilman here. And I think what we're looking at, I hear a lot of discussion on race. I get involved in race issues in our area. I think a lot of this reverse discrimination in many ways is a farce. I myself is waiting today to get a call from the EEOC in order to try to deal with some of the problems that we deal with, in the workforce. There is clear discrimination. I know on the local level, it's not on a higher level. And I think that what we're dealing with here is trying to paint a picture by which it makes it palatable now for many to discriminate. We talk about affirmative action, we talk about quotas, but the only time I know that quotas, if we want to use quotas for example, that is used is for companies to only hire just so many, and once they hit that ceiling, that's it.
Tell us about the Shreveport, Louisiana City Council. How many blacks and whites are on that council?
Well, we have 4 whites and 3 blacks.
And what about you, sir? What are you?
Well, I'm black.
And how do you all get along? How much of what your discussions are about?
I can assure you, it's like in many ways, we do it for the public. We try to work together in the public overall, but when it comes down to issues that is associated with the black community, you normally find a racial split that come about.
Well, will this discussion from the Oval Office have any impact on what you're doing in Shreveport, do you think?
People don't want to talk about it. That's the tough part. I myself tried to force the issue because I went to a predominantly white school, and I know it was very, very difficult to get through there. And when I did get through, I felt that I was very much educated, and I went on to become an engineer. But at the same time, here when the downsizing came to the company that I worked for, the only 2 people that was not rehired when they downsized and outsourced were the only 2 blacks who were there, and they had more education than the ones that they kept.
All right, sir. Thanks. What are you hearing here? You want to comment on?
Why don't you comment,
Mr. Thernstrom?
Well, I'm not quite sure what to make of that. Shreveport rang a bell for me because that was the first time I ever saw. In 1953, I visited my college debating partner over Christmas in Shreveport, Louisiana. It was a mix-up about the train I was coming on. I got off at the wrong. No one was there to meet me. I wandered into the station, and I was in the black section of the station, and I had not encountered Jim Crow, blacks only and whites only before. I'm sure there still are important racial tensions in a place like Shreveport, where Jim Crow is really not so very long ago. That's about all I can...
Well, I would be curious. You said you don't know what all this talk about racial preferences is. Probably the city has a set-aside in which for certain contracting set-aside, which in fact has no whites need apply. Practically every selective institution of higher education in this country is admitting blacks and Hispanics on the one hand by different and lower academic standards than whites and Asians on the other hand. I would call that a racial preference, and that is a, you know, that's the result of the fact that we do not, we have not solved our K through 12 education problem. I mean, the federal government, when Senator Dole asked for a list of racial preferences in the federal government, the Congressional Research Office came up with a list of 160, I'm sorry. Those were all clear. We're talking about racial classifications, putting citizens in one box, saying you're black, you're in that box, you get that, and that's very different than being white, and all blacks are alike and all whites are alike, and they're really separate nations within our nations, and all Hispanics are alike, which of course is a ridiculous notion. Asians alike, it's a ridiculous notion. The fact that all whites and blacks are alike are ridiculous notions. I mean, these are kind of, you know, I think this is an unfortunate putting of racial and ethnic labels on people, and I really think we should get beyond it in this society, and most Americans don't want it.
I don't know how much, if the word is irony, but if you open up to your chapter 1, what Professor Thernstrom just mentioned, the Jim Crow, leads off your whole book, and the first line in 1962, Colin and Alma Powell, you referenced there. Did that come across your mind when you watched this thing and acted unfold?
Right. We make the point there that as late as 1962, Colin Powell is assigned to a new post. He's driving with his new wife through Virginia, and the only place they can find to go to the bathroom is in the woods, because the service stations they come to get gas will sell them gas, but the facilities are for whites only.
You know, one of the things that's so interested us is how many, not just young people, but adults and highly educated adults have read the first third of our book, which in great part is a story of American apartheid in the South and a brutally discriminatory North up through the early 60s, and they have said to us, we did not know that story. We are astonished by that story. And I think it's in part because people like Jesse Jackson keep saying nothing has changed. Well, the result of saying nothing has changed is that they think the Jim Crow South was just like America today.
Leroy, New York, you're next.
Yes, I'd like to point out the impact of the inequitable distribution or funding of the school districts as a means by which discrimination continues against the minorities. I'm a Republican, was raised a Republican, still have very strong Republican beliefs. However, I went back to school to become a teacher later in life. I graduated with my degree at the age of 42 because I feel that the education system is strongly lacking in its preparation of our children, and the inequitable distribution of funds has been brought home to me personally because I've been exposed to a lot of different school systems through my college observations, my student teaching, and teaching placements.
Yeah, well, we certainly don't believe in an equitable distribution of school resources. I think the caller is wrong, though, to generalize from his experience. Washington, D.C., to take another example, spends over $10,000 per pupil per year, which is twice what most affluent suburbs spend. And indeed, we have a good 1989 national study that arrays all school districts by the percent minority and per capita spending. And they find that, in fact, the higher the minority enrollment in the school system, the higher the average per pupil expenditure. Now, it's very little difference. It's not much higher, but there is a slight positive correlation between percent minorities and spending, not the reverse correlation that the caller implies is common.
But the question is not how much money, but what is done with that money. And obviously, in a place like Washington, D.C., which is spending such a high per pupil amount on schooling, is not doing anything with that money to really educate those kids, and that's what's important.
Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom, we have about 4 minutes left. We go to East Lansing, Michigan. Go ahead, please. East Lansing, Michigan. You're on the air. Please go ahead. Let's try it one more time. Are you there, East Lansing?
Yes.
Go ahead. You're on the air.
I'm calling because I was interested in this book. I have not read it, but I did see the clip about when President Clinton quizzed Ms. Thernstrom and asked it a yes or no question, which reminds me a great deal of the old question of, have you quit beating your wife yet, yes or no? And I was outraged by his attempt to blackmail her into a corner, which he could then say she was a racist, because I think this is the reason a lot of the dialogue is muted, because if someone disagrees with many of these positions, they automatically are labeled racist.
Thanks, caller.
Well, I hope that that's not what the president was trying to do, and I don't think that it was. However, I think that you point to something very, very real, and that is that people feel very inhibited in talking about this issue, and particularly those who dissent from civil rights orthodoxy. They're very fearful of being labeled closet racists, if not overt racists. We've got to get beyond that. People on both sides, all sides of the political spectrum, most people have very good will on this issue.
I think someone has called my wife the high priestess of racial counter-revolution. I mean, it's so ludicrous. I can't believe it. But this is wicked stuff.
This is what the book looks like, America in Black and White, by Stephen Thernstrom and Abigail Thernstrom. I think that last call was from Rossville, Kansas, and now this call is from East Lansing. Is that correct, caller?
Yes.
Good morning.
Hi. Yeah, I guess you don't have much time. I wanted to give several reasons, but I guess if we wouldn't be having this conversation during the late 80s when a lot of corporation was downsizing, and because of that, a lot of white-collar workers were out of jobs. So what happened then, that's when honestly starting to hear about racial preferences and quotas. Now, before that, you never heard about anything like that, but until like to the late 80s, when there was corporation downsizing, and then a lot of white people were losing their jobs. So this is like a history repeating itself again, like in Germany and early part of American history, like Germans came to America, and also during the gold rush when a lot of whites were getting mad at Chinese because they kept finding gold, and they kept placing the Chinese back into higher places where they couldn't find no gold, but the Chinese kept finding more gold, and then eventually they kicked them out of America, sent them on the boat and kicked them out. So.
All right, caller, thanks. We are running out of time. And Stephen Thernstrom, you teach history. Is he right about all this?
Yeah, no, I don't think he's right. In fact, this real debate over preferences, the most important happening so far was in November 1996 in California, where the voters of California passed Proposition 209, saying the government should not give preferences to anyone or discriminate against them on the basis of race. At the time that 209 passed, the California economy was booming. In general, this debate has reached the level it has at a time when our economy is doing better than it has in the last 20 years. So that argument that the whites are only concerned about this because they're losing their jobs and they're kind of deflecting their anxieties onto blacks as a scapegoat, I don't think holds up.
Abigail Thernstrom, who invited you first to the Akron meeting? How did that happen?
Well, the call came from Ann Lewis, and that's all I know about it.
Was the deck stacked against you when you got there, or did you know what you were getting when you got there, before you got there?
Well, I was certainly the only dissenting voice, as far as I know, on the stage on the specific issue of racial preferences. And I think in general, ours is, and mine was there, a much more optimistic voice than those of others on the degree of racial progress we've made in the society, and both in terms of the status of blacks and the state of race relations, white attitudes, and so forth. We think we're not at the end of the road, but we have come a long way.
We're out of time, Stephen Thernstrom, but do you know whether the president's read your book or not?
We understand, and in fact, he said to us after the Akron meeting that he had read at least some of it, and he complimented us on it, and he
wrote a lovely note in the book about it, and he was lovely about the book, actually.
Abigail Thernstrom and her husband, Stephen Thernstrom, thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.